In the tumultuous aftermath of the Russian Revolution of 1917, one man emerged as the architect of a new era. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to the world as Lenin, would become the driving force behind one of the most significant social and political transformations of the 20th century. Howzit young Stashers? My name is Dr. Jacob Seidnote. This is Stashy, and you're watching The Historian Stash. As we saw earlier, after the overthrow of the Tsar in 1917, Russia came under the control of the provisional government, which was against radical social reform, and they still continued Russia's involvement in World War I. Both these standpoints were very unpopular among the majority of Russians. They wanted real change. So Lenin went about planning a coup d'etat or hostile takeover of the government. His selling point was that workers and peasants should directly rule. This was welcomed by workers and peasants as they demanded immediate change in what became known as the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks seized power and made Lenin the leader of the communist state. But as we saw, the Bolshevik Central Committee, which would become known as the Politburo, was not yet prepared to have the proletariat rule from below as Lenin had promised. And just because the Bolsheviks had emerged victorious didn't mean all the troubles of the Russian people disappeared. In fact, it was about to get a whole lot worse.
It was worse.
By early 1918, many cities in Western Russia faced famine as a result of long-term food shortages. Lenin blamed this on the so-called kulaks, or wealthier peasants, who allegedly stockpiled the grain that they had produced to increase its value. In May 1918, Lenin issued a requisitioning order that allowed soldiers to confiscate grain from kulaks for distribution in the cities, and in June he called for the formation of committees of poor peasants to aid in requisitioning. Basically, these were groups of people who were given permission to legally loot on behalf of the state.
Oh, how convenient.
This policy resulted in vast social disorder and violence, as soldiers clashed with peasant groups, helping to set the stage for the civil war that was to come. The forceful requisitions discouraged peasants from producing more grain than they could personally consume, so grain production decreased significantly.
You've got a problem here. Sort your problem.
The conditions were ripe for a flourishing black market which supplemented the official state-sanctioned economy. This meant that money that would have gone to the state was flowing into the black market. So, in an attempt to stop this money leak, Lenin ordered that speculators, black marketeers and looters, other than the ones he had appointed, be shot.
Well, that's one way to do it.
But Lenin eventually realized that the committees of the poor peasants were also targeting peasants who were not kulaks, and this resulted in anti-government feeling among the peasantry. So he abolished these committees in December 1918. Lenin repeatedly emphasized the need for terror and violence in overthrowing the old order and ensuring the success of the revolution. Speaking to the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of the Soviets in November 1917, he declared that the state is an institution built up for the sake of exercising violence. Previously, this violence was exercised by a handful of moneybags over the entire people. Now we want to organize violence in the interests of the people. In line with these sentiments, he strongly supported capital punishment. Lenin almost immediately feared that anti-Bolshevik forces would overthrow him, so in December 1917 he ordered the establishment of the Emergency Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage.
That's quite a mouthful.
Or the Cheka, which was the political police force led by Felix Dzerzhinsky. On the 30th of August 1918, Lenin was visiting a rally at the Michelson plant factory. After the rally, he left for his car when a woman approached with a complaint that bread was being confiscated at the railway stations. When Lenin turned towards her, she fired 3 shots with a Browning pistol, seriously wounding him. The woman was a socialist revolutionary called Fanny Kaplan. She was chased down and eventually surrendered. Kaplan was then executed by the Cheka. In September, as a response to the assassination attempt, the Sovnarkom passed a decree that initiated the Red Terror, a system of repression orchestrated by the Cheka. Although described as an attempt to eliminate the entire bourgeoisie, Lenin didn't want to exterminate all members of this class, only those who were looking to re-establish their rule. The majority of the Red Terror's victims were well-to-do citizens or former members of the Tsarist regime. But then others were non-bourgeois anti-Bolsheviks, as well as perceived social undesirables such as prostitutes.
There is something wrong somewhere.
The Cheka claimed the right to both sentence and execute anyone whom it deemed to be an enemy of the government, without recourse. So throughout Soviet Russia, the Cheka carried out killings, often in large numbers. Lenin never witnessed this violence nor participated in it firsthand, and publicly distanced himself from it. His published articles and speeches rarely called for executions, but he regularly did so in his coded telegrams and confidential notes. Many Bolsheviks expressed disapproval of the Cheka's mass executions and feared the organization's apparent unaccountability. The Communist Party tried to restrain the Cheka's activities in February 1919, stripping it of its powers of tribunal and execution in those areas not under official martial law. But the Cheka continued unfazed in large parts of the country. By 1920, the Cheka had become the most powerful institution in Soviet Russia, exerting influence over all other state departments. A decree in April 1919 resulted in the establishment of concentration camps, which were entrusted to the Cheka and later administered by a new government agency called the Gulag. By the end of 1920, 84 camps, which were called gulags, had been established across Soviet Russia, holding about 50,000 prisoners. By October 1923, this had grown to a whopping 315 camps and about 70,000 inmates. Those interned in the camps were used as slave labor. From July 1922, intellectuals deemed to be opposing the Bolshevik government were exiled to inhospitable regions or deported from Russia altogether. Lenin personally inspected the lists of those to be dealt with in this manner. By 1921, Russia was suffering economically. It was going through one of its worst droughts ever, which was only aggravated by the policy of Prodrazovvostoka. The policy of Prodrazovvostoka.
Let me repeat this. Nizozwa kahle.
The policy of Prodrazovvostoka.
I don't understand.
The policy of Prodrazovvostoka. by the policy of Projovyostka.
You get it? If you don't get it, forget about it.
This policy was unpopular not only because people couldn't pronounce it, but also because it involved the requisitioning of large quantities of grain for state use and for export. All these factors eventually led to the Russian famine of 1921, which was the most severe famine that the country had experienced since 1891. It resulted in an estimated 5 million deaths. Linked to this, Russia was facing an economic disaster because of its involvement in the First World War as well as its own civil war, which we covered last time. During the Russian Civil War, Lenin and his Bolsheviks introduced a disastrous economic policy known as war communism. War communism's main features were the expropriation of private business, the nationalization of industry throughout Soviet Russia, and the forced requisition of surplus grain and other food products from the peasantry by the state. The government essentially stripped the country of all its production in order to serve the war effort. But this only plunged Russia deeper into economic devastation. So Lenin was desperate to boost the economy. He saw that the extreme centralization of the economy under traditional socialism that was adopted by the Bolsheviks when they took power was not the best way to get the economy going. Instead, he introduced the New Economic Policy, or the NEP. Now, this economic policy included a free market and capitalism. While these concepts did not fit in the whole communist ideology, Lenin still somehow wanted the NEP to be subjected to state administration, while the socialized state enterprises would function on a profit basis. The nationalization of industry was partially withdrawn by the Soviet authorities, and a system of mixed economy was implemented. On the one hand, this system allowed private individuals to own small enterprises, but on the other hand, the state continued to regulate banks, foreign trade, and large industries. Furthermore, the NEP did away with the policy of Projovyostka.
Listen properly.
It introduced a system known as prodnalog, which basically imposed taxes on farmers, payable in the form of raw agricultural product. This allowed them to keep and trade at least part of their produce. Thus, the adoption of the NEP also signaled the beginning of a new agricultural policy. For example, the Bolsheviks saw the traditional village as pre-modern and backward. Hence, the NEP only permitted private landholdings because the idea of collectivized farming met strong backlash. In light of severe economic conditions in Russia, Lenin's policies opened up markets to the greater degree of free trade, hoping to lure the large population to increase production. However, economic historians argue that Lenin's policies didn't only restore private property rights, profits, and a whole range of other capitalist enterprises, but his policies turned to international capitalist markets for support and aid. Lenin had the belief that in order to achieve socialism, he had to generate what he called the missing material prerequisites of modernization and industrial development that made it possible for Soviet Russia to fall back on a centrally supervised market influence program of state capitalism.
They call that a paradox.
In this regard, Lenin followed the logic of Marxism that a society must first reach the full stage of capitalism as a precondition for socialism to be adopted. Karl Marx assumed and theorized that the working class would gain a collective class consciousness and be powerful enough because of their numerical advantage and be able to control the most vital sectors of industry, to gain social and political power to form a classless and stateless society which was equal. Lenin's theory, called Leninism, can be considered a development of Marx's theory. Lenin theorized that the minority working class of the Soviet Union could be able to conscientize and inspire peasants and other workers in other countries to seize state power, but not abolish the state as in Marx's analysis, and political thinking. Lenin was a dedicated Marxist and believed that his interpretation of Marxism, which is called Leninism, was the only authentic and orthodox one. It's how Marxism should be according to him. According to Leninism, humanity would eventually reach pure communism, becoming a stateless, classless, egalitarian society of workers who were free from exploitation and alienation, controlled their own destiny, and abided by the rule from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Lenin's Marxist beliefs led him to the view that society couldn't transform directly from its present state to communism. Rather, it must first enter a period of socialism, and so his main concern was how to convert Russia into a socialist society. To do so, he believed that a dictatorship of the proletariat was necessary to suppress the bourgeoisie and develop a socialist economy. He defined socialism as an order of civilized cooperators in which the means of production are socially owned, and believed that this economic system had to be expanded until it could create a society of abundance. To achieve this, the Russian economy had to be brought under state control, with all citizens becoming so-called hired employees of the state. Lenin's interpretation of socialism was centralized, planned, and statist, with both production and distribution strictly controlled by the state. He believed that all workers throughout the country would voluntarily join to enable the state's economic and political centralization. In this way, his calls for workers' control of the means of production referred not to the direct control of enterprises by their workers, but the operation of all enterprises under the control of a workers' state. This resulted in what could be considered somewhat of a paradox.
They call that a paradox.
Lenin wanted popular workers' control, but then he also called for a centralized, hierarchical, coercive state apparatus. Before 1914, Lenin's views were largely in accordance with mainstream European Marxism. Although he criticized Marxists who adopted ideas from contemporary non-Marxist philosophers and sociologists, many of his own ideas were influenced not only by Russian Marxist theory, but also by wider ideas from the Russian revolutionary movement. He adapted his ideas according to changing circumstances, including the pragmatic realities of governing Russia amid war, famine, and economic collapse. As Leninism developed, Lenin revised the established Marxist theory and introduced innovations in Marxist thought. In his theoretical writings, Lenin discussed what he regarded as developments in capitalism since Marx's death. In his view, it had reached a new stage of state monopoly capitalism. He believed that although Russia's economy was dominated by the peasantry, the presence of monopoly capitalism in Russia meant that the country was sufficiently materially developed to move to socialism. Leninism adopted a more absolutist and rigid perspective than other variants of Marxism, and distinguished itself by its liberationist vision. It also stood out by emphasizing the role of a vanguard, such as his Bolsheviks, who could lead the proletariat to revolution, and gave prominence to violence as a revolutionary instrument. And this didn't just mean violence in the sense of violence of words.
I don't want you to speak here! Your words are violence!
This actually meant violence.
I choose violence.
Lenin became seriously ill by the second half of 1921, experiencing hyperacusis, insomnia, and regular headaches. At the Politburo's insistence, in July he left Moscow for a month's leave at his mansion in Gorky. Yeah, he was a communist, but even a communist could afford the luxury of a mansion.
Absolutely.
Here he was cared for by his wife and sister. 26 doctors were also hired to help Lenin during his final years. Many of them weren't even Russian, and they had been brought in at great expense. another luxury communists could afford, apparently. Some of the doctors suggested that his sickness could have been caused by metal oxidation from the bullets that were still lodged in his body from the 1918 assassination attempt. So in April 1922, he underwent a surgical operation to remove them. Despite the operation being a success, the symptoms continued, and Lenin's doctors were now unsure of the cause. In May 1922, Lenin had his first stroke, temporarily losing his ability to speak and being paralyzed on his right side. He recuperated at Gorky, and by July he had recovered to a large degree. In October, he returned to Moscow, but then in December he had a second stroke and returned to Gorky to recover. In March 1923, Lenin had his third stroke. This would turn out to be the final straw for his ailing body. Lenin lost his ability to speak, and later that month he experienced partial paralysis on his right side and began exhibiting sensory aphasia. By May, he appeared to be making a slow recovery, regaining some of his mobility, speech and writing skills. In October, he made a final visit to the seat of government, the Kremlin, in Moscow. On the 21st of January 1924, Vladimir Lenin fell into a coma and died later that day at the age of 53. His official cause of death was recorded as an incurable disease of the blood vessels. The Soviet government publicly announced Lenin's death on the 22nd of January. On the 23rd of January, mourners from the Communist Party, trade unions and Soviets visited his Gorky home to inspect the body, which was carried aloft in a red coffin by leading Bolsheviks. The coffin was then transported by train to Moscow and taken to the House of Trade Unions, where Lenin's body lay in state. Over the next 3 days, around 1 million mourners came to see the body, many queuing for hours in freezing conditions. Lenin's funeral took place on the 27th of January, when his body was carried to Red Square, where assembled crowds listened to a series of speeches before the body was placed into the vault of a specially erected mausoleum. Despite the freezing temperatures, tens of thousands attended the funeral. Now, you cannot but wonder how many of those were there because they wanted to be there, or were there because the Cheka told them they should be there. Later, Lenin's body was embalmed to preserve it for long-term public display in the Red Square Mausoleum. In July 1929, the Politburo agreed to replace the temporary mausoleum with a permanent one in granite, which was finished in 1933. To this day, Lenin's body remains on public display in the mausoleum on the Red Square. Lenin's administration laid the framework for the system of government that ruled Russia for 7 decades and provided the model for later communist-led states that came to cover a third of the inhabited world in the mid-20th century. As a result, Lenin's influence went viral. However, Lenin was and still is a controversial figure. He remains both reviled and revered, an historical figure who has both been idolized and demonized. Even during his lifetime, Lenin was loved and hated, admired and scorned by the Russian people. But it is undeniable that Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov Lenin was one of, if not the most significant leader of the 20th century. And then came Joseph Stalin. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the Historian Stash on YouTube for more content. Until next time, from Stashy and myself, stay stashy.